Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual lecture, Chinatown Through a Wide Lens, the hidden photographs of Yucho Chow. I'm Sarah Carlson, and I'm the programs manager here at the Vancouver Heritage Foundation. And I have the pleasure of being joined tonight by Catherine Clement. We are delighted to have you here with us today. So before I get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that the city of Vancouver and the area that we are exploring today is on the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. VHF is a registered charity that promotes the appreciation and conservation of heritage places in Vancouver. We do this through educational programming, special projects, informational resources, and grants. We have a number of upcoming events, all of which can be found on our website. So I just wanted to mention a few before we get started. We launched our first ever online auction, and it's running until this Thursday, October 29th at 8 p.m. You can bid on unique heritage themed items and experiences, which raise essential funds to support our educational programs, projects, and grants. We are hosting a virtual workshop with Christine Allen on November 4th at 6:30 p.m. on planning a heritage garden. So if you missed it in the spring, now's your chance. And our next virtual walking tour with guide John Atkin will be through Beaconsfield and into the Renfrew Ravine on November 5th at 1 p.m. So this evening's presentation is the first of our digital evening lectures for the fall season. Although we cannot be together in person, we're really grateful for our program partner for the series, the University Women's Club of Vancouver, and in particular, Kathy Barford, for working with us to offer this series at Highcroft Manor since 2012. We look forward to returning to our in-person programming when it's safe to do so. The second lecture in the series will be on Vancouver After Dark with author Erin Chapman on Tuesday, November 17th, featuring stories of Vancouver's historical night spots. So before I pass things over to Catherine, I'm just going to let you know how to participate in tonight's event. It'll be a little bit different than our usual lectures. So you'll be kept on mute during the session. So if you have any questions or issues, please type them into the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be monitoring that. There will be time for Catherine to answer some questions at the end. So please feel welcome if you have anything that comes up during her talk, put it into the chat and we'll be able to get to that at the end. So I'm going to introduce Catherine so we can make a start. So Catherine Clement is a community curator and designer based in Vancouver's Chinatown. Her work focuses on uncovering and sharing the lesser known stories of the community. For 5 years, she was curator for the Chinese Canadian Military Museum. And in 2017, Catherine art directed a Canada 150 exhibit called Chinatown History Windows, which brought history to the streets. In May 2019, after 8 years of research, she mounted her first ever exhibition on photographer Yucho Chow. This work, a book with many additional photographs, was published earlier this year. So thanks to Catherine for being here tonight, and over to you.
So welcome everybody. I'm sorry I can't actually see you in person, but I'm hoping that that you will still enjoy this story nevertheless. I'd like to spend a little bit of tonight telling you about the story behind the story, so how I discovered this, and setting a little bit of context around the time period that we're looking at. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about this man called Yucho Chow. And lastly, I'm going to spend the bulk of the time looking at his photography, which spanned a very interesting period of time in Vancouver's history, and looking at what these photographs tell us. So the first thing I'm going to do is stop my own video. And then I'm going to have you look at this particular quote. "The photograph is a memento, evidence that this moment existed in the world at some point in time." And that's what makes these a really remarkable set of photographs that you're going to see, because they also reveal a lot of hidden stories. Now, the background to how I came across this was around 2010. I was going around and interviewing World War II veterans. And most of them were in their late 80s and early 90s at that time. And I discovered that one of the ways to get them talking was to ask them to pull out their photo albums. So it was a very low barrier way to get people to start to remember things about, I was mainly interested in the war period, but it gets them talking. And through those interviews, I remember this was one of the first ones I ever saw. So this is the Kobong family. They were Victoria family. And what's interesting is that 4 of the children from that family served in World War II, even though, and they were all Canadian born, but they actually didn't have citizenship. So this was very interesting. And the whole story around this is that it was through serving in the war that Chinese gained the right to become called Canadian. But so this is one of the first ones I saw. And then I would go to the next family and I would see another one. And then I would go to the next family and I saw this particular one. And all of these photos had on them, somewhere around the frame, a little seal that said Yucho Chow. And I thought that was a very catchy name. And I quite liked his seal. It was really kind of attractive. If actually his name is in there in Chinese, but it's also a hand-drawn seal. And I kept seeing this. So by the time I got to the 6th family, I thought I should Google this guy, like this Yucho Chow, like his photos are appearing from like early 1910s all the way into the late 1940s. So who was he? And I Googled his name. This was 10 years ago. And there was practically nothing on him. There was a smattering of photos in UBC. But basically, he was like this ghost. There was no photos of him and very little information on him. And that sent me on an 8-year search to try to find his work. And every time I met a family or did an interview, I would say to them, do you have a Yucho Chow photo? And invariably they would tell me no. And then I would ask to see their photo albums. And sure enough, they had Yucho Chows in there. But it took me 5 years to find my first photo of what he looked like. So again, he was this ghost and I could only imagine what he looked like. And it was, so 5 years to find my first photo. And then after I found that, I did a little history window to him in that project in 2017. That caught the attention of the Vancouver Sun. They did a story on it and my whole life changed. This story, I thought I was just looking for the story of one man. And in looking for the story of one, I found the story of many. But before we go too much further, I kind of want to set the context for the time in which he was photographing. And I call it the best of times and the worst of times. And that's because, 1885, the railroad's completed and there's a lot of, suddenly Canada opens up, the doors and the welcome mat goes out and they start these huge campaigns, the Canadian government, through the United States, through Britain and throughout all of Europe, asking for people to come, like enticing them with these kinds of photos and to come and make Canada their new homeland. And of course, it looks very ideal and lovely. And so interestingly, though, even though the welcome mat was out, it wasn't really for everybody. Government was very clear of who was welcome and who wasn't. And certainly one of the groups, which we sometimes forget, had probably one of the worst times of all, were actually the Chinese, who came by the thousands to actually build the railroad. I remember reading this article where they would put out ads for white men living in British Columbia to come and build the railroad through the mountains, and they just couldn't get enough guys. They might need 500, they would get 20 or 30. So that's one of the reasons why they looked east to China to bring men here to build the railroad through the most difficult terrain of all and the most dangerous. But soon as that last spike went in, it was shortly after that around that time, I should say, that the first head tax came in. And then there was another head tax and then another head tax. And then by 1923, you had total exclusion. Basically, it was in Canadian history, Chinese are the only group that were ever completely barred from from immigrating into Canada. And then at the same time, there were all sorts of different kinds of policies and head taxes and other things that were happening specifically to Chinese. But they weren't the only group that was also really struggling in a very unwelcome country. The other was, of course, Sikh Canadians. Many of you would have heard of the Kamagata Maru and what happened there with that ship and being turned back. And it's interesting, the newspaper article here says, Hindus may be British subjects, but they're not citizens. And then the article goes on to say why they're not wanted here is succinctly explained by a local member. So interestingly, a Hindu historian told me, you know, Catherine, you have to remember, like in the early 1900s, you know, no white barber would cut our hair and no white tailor would make us a suit and no white photographer would take our photographs. So we ended up in Chinatown at Yucho Chow. And then, of course, there's the other group, that the Indigenous population whose whole culture is thrown into chaos with the founding of residential schools. And many of you have heard lately the controversy around John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister. But here's actually a quote that he gave in the House of Commons. So this results in a lot of families being torn apart and all the other kind of intergenerational trauma that results in. So that was also happening at the same time. And interestingly, though, I learned this, is that even amongst the white population, there was a pecking order. So a Ukrainian family who gave me a photo, one of them said to me, look, Catherine, you know, we may have been white, but you know, we were considered the bottom of the barrel. We had heavy accents, we had these strange names, we were considered this sort of, you know, rudimentary peasant stock. And interesting, this is from Canadian Geographic magazine, these photos, like a very old issue of it. And I find it interesting that with those little boys eating their sandwiches, the caption on that photo was some non-Anglo-Saxon boys having their lunch at an Alberta school in 1932. So there was really a sense of a pecking order even amongst the white community. And it's into this environment that this kind of round-faced, sort of squat cigar smoking photographer makes his entry and starts this tiny little commercial studio, which he would have never realized recorded so much of our unknown history. I want to just remind people before I go on to tell a little bit more about him, about the role of photography at this time. So photography in the early 1900s, leading up even into the 1940s, is very special. So almost nobody has a camera, first of all. So also they're expensive, and producing film or plates is very expensive. And you only had one shot at it. You had to be good at lighting, etc. And for people who commissioned photographs, often they would have to save up for quite a while to get one done. And then they would make an appointment and dress in their Sunday best and head down to get their photograph taken. But photographs were remarkably special. So you may only have one. And it's interesting how for some families, there may only be one or two photographs of the first generation that comes here. I'm just showing you a few examples. Here's an interesting one, the Sam Hop family. I find it's interesting the way he's tilted his head there, but also, and I don't know why this happened, Yucho Chow was so fussy. So he's hand painted this, which cost a little extra. But also if you look at the bottom left, you see the carpeting is sort of all broken up there. And that's unusual that he left that in there. He didn't crop it out. But for these families, this was something special. And usually what people wanted to do is these photos were actually mainly done to be sent back home to China or to Europe. And part of there were many reasons to take photos, but one was to be able to show the people back home that you were successful, to introduce a new generation of children that were born here, to their relatives back in the old country. And we're going to see how even props made a huge difference in what a photograph was trying to say. So when I first met Yucho Chow, I thought he was a Chinese photographer who only took photos of Chinese. And that's because, as I said, in the first 5 years, that's all I ever saw. A little bit about him. He came in 1902, so he paid the head tax. He would have paid $100. We don't know what he did for the first few years. The kind of the legend in the family is that he might have served as a houseboy, but we don't know that for sure. The first time we see him, there's a little ad in the paper in 1906 saying that he does translation and handwriting in very beautiful calligraphy, and he was very much an artist. So this is the first from 1906, and Chinese interpreter. Good handwriting, proper style. And that address, 443 Carroll Street, is actually part of a larger block of buildings that were for a mission, a Christian Methodist mission that existed there in 1906. But he first appears in the city directory in 1907, running Yucho Chow Studios. And he runs it from 1907 to 1949, when he dies suddenly in November of 1949. And then his two sons take it over from 1950 to 1986. And they retire in 1986 and close. That's about 80 years worth of photographs. And if I need to remind you that 1907 to 1949 was a very tumultuous and transformative period. If we think what happened, we went through the First World War. We went through the race riots, I should say, in 1907. That was the first thing. Then the First World War. Then we went through the Spanish flu. And then we went through the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923. Then we went through the Great Depression. Then we went through the Second World War. And finally, the winning of citizenship for Chinese in 1947. But a really transformative period in time when, as I mentioned earlier, the country is opening up to new immigrants too. This is his second location. This is the building right at the corner of Carroll and Pender. And if you look up that telephone pole, you'll see just to the right at the top, Yucho Chow Studio. So he had this is his second studio on the upper floor. Then, so he's there for a while. And then in 1914, he moves to his first street level. And this really helped him enormously because now he had a retail street level studio. People could come in at any time of the day. He was open rain or shine, day or night. He slept in the back and had a little doorbell. You can see this is that 23. And if you go to the far left of the picture, just where the fire hydrant is, you'll see Yucho Chow Photo Supply House. So he also sold a few other things there, but he lived in the back of that one. And then in 1930, just when the Depression started, he moved studios again to 518 Main Street. And he stayed there until he died. And about a year after that, his sons moved again. But what's interesting to note here is all this stuff he's got. Like, it's a very busy little, lots of things going on, lots of different logos on either of the two windows. You'll see two different logos. See a logo at the top. Everybody knows Yucho Chow, rain or shine, anything, anywhere, anytime. And he was true to his word with that. And we'll see that in some of the photos. But here's something else I wanted to draw your attention to is, so because this was taken 1930, 1950, so the war comes in to this period, is you will notice above his door, it says Chinese photographer. And that really makes us realize this was taken during the war, because it was at a time when, because of what happened to the Japanese in Canada, many Chinese businesses wound up putting up signs, basically saying, we all look alike, but we're Chinese and we're trustworthy. I just want to show you a few of his storefront windows, because these are not in the book. and you may not otherwise get a chance to see them. So interestingly, you see a lot of white people in those photographs. This is the other side. There's one photo I have with Roy Rogers, a picture of Roy Rogers in a black hat, which is interesting because Roy Rogers usually wore a white hat. And you can see again, open day or night. So he worked hard. His children played a role, and that's very common in many early families that ran businesses. Their children would get involved. So this is his oldest daughter, Mabel. And there's such an age gap between her and the other kids that she, for the longest time, was his only assistant. And she would carry the heavy tripods. She would, set the lights. She would help develop the film and do many other things and serve as his muse. So there's a lot of early photographs of her where he's practicing his art. Then later on, two of his sons, this is Peter and then Philip, took over. They're the ones that ran it from 50 to 86. And the other one was his daughter. So another daughter named Jessie. And Jessie became, she did the hand painting, which was something really special to learn. And I wanted you to see this photo because this is an early one that she hand painted, which clearly looks like it's been hand painted. And then we go to this one, which she does within a period about 6 years later. And you might not even be able to know that's hand painted, except if you see it close up. You can see the oil on it. So very, very remarkable and talented children who worked with him those long hours too. This is one I used in the show. It just shows the inside of his studio. Again, kind of messy, kind of cluttered. It says, "We specialize in oil colored photographs." And below that, you might not be able to read it, but it says, "We keep all negatives." And that segues nicely into the next one. So this is after he dies. This is now the studio's moved to 512 Main Street. And in 1986, when the sons retire, they have all these negatives and they have no idea what to do with them all. And they thought, maybe we don't own this, maybe these belong to the people who commissioned these. Like, do we really have a right to do anything with them? And so 5 truckloads of history from inside that studio went to the dump. And that's why I could find nothing on Yucho Chow. And it made me realize that if I was to find his work, I would find it only in private family albums. And that's what set me on that journey of 8 years of every time I interviewed people, asking them if they had one. And finding that, they sort of like, I collected them one photo at a time, one family at a time, and one story at a time. So as I said, I always thought he was a Chinese photographer because much of what I saw in the first 5 years was photographs of Chinese. This is Wei-Sun Choi, the author, his family. So these are all the ones I saw in those early years. But after I did that history window and that Vancouver Sun story changed everything. And suddenly I was hearing from so many other communities that said, hey, wait a minute. Like a woman that I met named Judith Maxey told me he was the main, huge photographer for the early Black Canadian community. And she said, growing up, I remember seeing Yucho Chows in all these different families. And this is one of the McFadden families. And in fact, the father is American. And I spoke to the son there, Charles McFadden. And Charles said to me that they had the name McFadden, the Scottish name, because that had been the name of the father's descendants, the slave owner. But Charles also told me of how even into the 50s and 60s, when he went, he was married, he would go to rent an apartment and he would call ahead of time. The apartment was, available. And as soon as they walked up the steps, they were told the apartment was gone, even though they called like 5 minutes before. So he certainly experienced some racism. This is another family, Howard Fair and his mother in the 40s. Louis and Edna Lawrence. Louis was a champion boxer. He was actually in New Brunswick. So his family came through the Underground Railroad. And this is a group of women. These are actually Hindu Canadian women. There were fewer Hindu Canadians here than Sikh Canadians, larger Sikh population. This is Janki Shori. She's also Hindu origins. And she was married to the fellow who ran the New Delhi Cabaret, very famous club in the 50s and 60s. Had a terrible marriage to him. He was just like, you can imagine, he's managing a club, what goes on. But she did very well on her own. She wound up introducing Bollywood films to the Lower Mainland. Another family, this is a Sikh family now. I need to stop on this man because he's very interesting. So Ishar Singh Gill, he actually went by many names. That was his official name. He came in 1906. But he ran a little business called Patterson Wood Yard, and he would deliver wood, home heating to people. So all his customers called him Patterson. But interestingly, on all his government documents, he is simply known as Hindu number 10, even though he's not even Hindu, he's Sikh. But the great story around this picture is he's so well dressed, and he's got that dog. It's one of the few pictures I've seen with dogs. And that dog would accompany him everywhere when he was delivering wood. And the dog, he gave the dog the name King. And what the family told me is that he loved that dog so much that every single dog since then, and this is going back to like 1917, every single dog that family has owned since then has been named King. What a lovely tribute. This is the Nacelle family. So they're actually Swedish, and they came to Canada when their farmhouse burned down and they lost everything. This is hand colorized. The Tursa children, they're actually Bohemians. So I'm part of Czechoslovakia that they came from. And when they showed me their pictures, they would have a picture of like the 2 kids, then the 3 kids, and then the next with 4 kids, and then the 5 kids. And they told me this story that their parents had this very tempestuous relationship, and they would break up. And then every time they got back together again, another kid was born. So this is the final photo. Shortly after this, though, the parents broke up for good, and these children wound up in orphanages, which was very sad to hear. But they look very sweet in this photo. This is related to the Kosovic family and Croatian family. Lily and Esther Weinstein, the 2 little girls that are dressed alike, Romanian Jews. The Bodlik family, Polish. So again, a lot of Eastern Europeans here. The Bush family, German. DeMarchi family, Italian. I love how she's wearing a silk dress, and the way the lighting is done is it really shows up the shimmer in that silk dress. Fred and Emily, these are also Italian. I included Fred in here because he wound up being a very big supporter during the Second World War of Mussolini, and he wound up being interred in Ontario, in Petawawa, because of that. Another Italian family. This is a rare outdoor family shot, all very nicely dressed. The Grant family. Now this is actually a mixed race family, and some of you may have seen this before. So the mother is Musqueam and the father is Chinese. And there's actually a long history between Chinese and Indigenous people in marriages and relationships. And they struggled between these 2 worlds as a family. This is an unidentified mixed race marriage from the mid-1940s. We don't know who they are. Another one. But his lens was wide, not just in terms of people, but in terms of other things that he captured, like opera singers, Jack Strong and Pat LaBelle. They were a vaudeville act. Howard Fair. He also did vaudeville. He was did this kind of show called the Footlight Frolic, which was in some of the big theaters here. It was like singers and dancers and magicians, etc. And he was born in Vancouver, but his billing was, the way they sold his act was Harlem at its best. But I love this photo. It's one of my favorite. Little fingers sticking up. Sikh Canadian musicians. Russian Canadians. He did a lot of photos of Russian Canadians in these large groupings for musicians and entertainers. Yucho Chow's lens was wide in that he did people that were obviously wealthy to those who didn't have a lot of money, to some really well-known people like Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was kind of the founder of modern China. Juan Alexander Kumyat, some of you may know him, but he was basically, they believe to be the first Chinese born in Canada and had a very illustrious career, very distinguished man. He voted when he was very young, and then the vote was taken away, and he wound up voting again when he was like 82 or something before he died. Yip Sang, who was highly influential, is the famous Yip Sang building in Chinatown. H.Y. Louis. So H.Y. Louis was the founder of what is now the London Drugs, IGA chain. And his son, the one leaning against him there, standing up leaning against him, was the one who took it over, Tong Louis, also a famous philanthropist. And this is the Opal family. And that's Wally Opal, our former Attorney General and man who's done a lot in his career, a very distinguished career. His father died shortly after this photo was taken. And his mother, all alone here, not speaking English very well, had to try to survive doing housework and bought a cow and tried to, make some extra money selling milk, like a really hard life. But she must be very proud of her son. Yucho Chow also did, this is the inside of the Wong Association. So this is a rare shot to see. This is their school. And I love the mirrors. I don't know how well you can see them, but the mirrors play on, one, making the room bigger, but secondly, let you see some of the faces of the people that are here. They got a Gestetner or something they're using. A lot of pictures of trucks. And I think it was because when it was a really big thing to have a produce company and finally be able to afford a truck. So lots of trucks. This I found in Karamis, and it's from the Ranch House restaurant there. It's taken in the 1930s. 1920s, I should say, actually. Cowboy, unknown cowboy. Inside the Sikh temple. So the Sikh Canadian community really adopted Yucho Chow. Like he was so welcome into their lives that he had this rare privilege of being able to photograph inside their temple. And the other thing he did in 1958, there was a very famous funeral. Mehwa Singh was an activist Sikh Canadian. He actually, a Sikh, I should say, not Canadian necessarily, but Sikh Canadian. He wound up killing an immigration officer, a very divisive immigration officer. And then he was put to death. And this is his funeral. And there was only one photographer allowed, and it was Yucho Chow. So the other thing he did is he took pictures of babies when they were born. He took pictures of people once they died. And those death photos were often sent back home, and they kind of served as death certificates. He also did many photos for renewal of head tax certificates. So here's one of a Wong Mo, a tailor. And there's that's not the exact same photo, but it's the same day, the same photo shoot. That's Wong Mo with his business partner. As well as these. My whole next show is going to be on these pieces. And this is, the H.Y. Louis family, again, the IGA London Drugs. This was one of their sons, Quan Louis. Quan, even though he was born in Canada, he was not a Canadian citizen. And in the Exclusion Act, he was given this card. If you look at the very bottom of the card, it says, "This certificate does not establish legal status in Canada." So he's born here, but he's not a Canadian, but he's not Chinese. In some ways, he's stateless. And yet this little guy went on to volunteer to serve in the war. And he died a horrible death in bomber command, in a bomber over France, where the whole plane it was hit and caught on fire. And yet, anyway. So this is a photo Yucho Chow took of him for these particular certificates. So I might move along a little quicker here. Sorry, I tend to go over here. The photo is witness. So even if you didn't know much about history, these photos, you start to notice a pattern in these photos, and I wanted to kind of show you some of those and what they say and what's the commonality between people too. So many of the life and conditions are reflected. So I remember in the early days, I kept on seeing only photos of men. So men, more men. More men. And then I remembered is that the Exclusion Act made it very difficult. There were very few families here, very few women here and children. And so these photos were of men who were here, often had wives back in China. And they would take these photos to send back to their family. And again, part of it was to say everything was well. That guy has a pen in his pocket. Yucho Chow had a box of pocket watches and pens and little props and things that you could use, personal accessories, earrings, if you wanted to look more successful in your photos. So this is taken in the 1930s, and I find it interesting in the 30s, there's a lot of photos with two men together. And I have a feeling, I don't know this for sure, but that because money was so tight and because the recession, actually, the Great Depression affected Chinese more than other groups, very high suicide rate at that time, that these men would have pooled their money together to take a photograph. So it would cost the same whether there was one or two, but this way they could pool their money. I brought this photo in because I wanted to show you something. So one of the things too is that people didn't have a lot. So they would frequently borrow a suit from somebody else to have their photo taken. And it's really clear to me that the guy sitting down, especially, that suit is too big for him. And maybe he's sitting down for a reason, because it was too big and it was just designed to hide that. So he wouldn't have had a lot of money. But Yucho gave him a couple of pens there, and his friend has a pen, and they're looking more official. And again, they're wanting, people often gave loans for the men to come over here. And I think they wanted to be able to show the investment had been worth it. But interestingly, that kind of longtime bachelor, or men living on their own for many years, was also very common with other groups. A lot of the Eastern European immigrants, for example, you'll see a lot of them by themselves, or again, 1930s, there was somebody else. They would often wait 5, 6, 8, 10 years before they could bring their families over. And here's an example of how people longed for their families, missed their kids, missed their wives. And so John here, this is a photo taken at Yucho Chow studio. But then he gets another photo of his wife and son, and he has Yucho Chow do an early Photoshop to bring them together. So at least in a photograph, they were reunited. And that's true in Chinese families. Some men had 2 wives. Here you're seeing the first wife often stayed in China. And here you're seeing the woman on the left holding the baby on the chair, and the little girl on the far right. Both of those have been superimposed, and they're still in China. But this is the way he brought his family all together, families. This is a bit different in that the woman sitting in the front row with her hands clasped is actually gone. She had died before this photo was taken. And so the family arranged for somebody else to sit into that spot. And then Yucho Chow superimposed an earlier photo of the wife onto someone else's head. But again, I think it's so loving. It just shows how much people missed each other and loved each other and wanted to be seen together. This is another story of love. So Dan Karbanga, she almost looks nervous, this young woman, a little scared, looks like she doesn't have a lot of money. She's married at the time, but she doesn't live very long. And so interestingly, so this is probably taken in the 1920s. In the 1970s, her husband missed her so much that he got a photo of himself done. Yucho Chow's long gone now, and had it superimposed into the original photo. But now it looks odd because he is so much older than her. But it's just so sweet. Excuse me, trends and styles. So one of the things I noticed, and this again is showing the commonality amongst different groups, is that, the wedding, the importance of weddings. So that lots and lots and lots of wedding photos, and not surprisingly, that people used, because they had little money, they used special occasions to do this. So this is a Croatian family. This is another unidentified family, but our wedding couple. But even amongst the Chinese, the idea of the elaborate wedding and sort of princess look is very important. And this is taken in the 30s during the Depression, believe it or not. But interestingly, I found that starting in the war period around 42, 43, leading up to about 1950, many of the wedding photos were people in business attire suits. So there's this change that happens. This is Herman and Francis. Herman worked for the Black Porters Union. But you see he's now, they're wearing more like regular street clothing. Albert and Daisy, you may notice they have matching suits on. And Albert actually was a tailor. So when he decided he would make them exactly the same suit, which is very sweet. The other thing I noticed in clothing is that in earlier photos for different groups, but particularly for Chinese, because they had very distinctive costumes, that a good photo involved wearing a traditional outfit. So very traditional looking outfits. But then you start to see a change. And here's Pearl Goon and her friends. And now you're starting to look much more Western. And doing their hair, look at the hair, like they would have to curl that. And that was very popular style in the 20s and into the 30s. This is Wang Chu Lip's wife. Wang Chu Lip was the one who founded Mingwo Cookware in Chinatown. So again, she's looking very Western, fur around her. Haircut is very Western, as is this woman. So their sense of what makes a great picture, I'm going to have only one picture taken, what am I going to wear, now starts to transform it to be Western garb. And this is Ella and Linda Lee, and I use this partly because they're actually mother and daughter, but everyone thought they were sisters. They look so close in age. And this is the Hindustani Young Men's Association. And I find it interesting because you're seeing, again, some people making this transition to be very Western. They're not wearing their turbans, others are. This is early Yucho Chow. The other thing I would often notice is how the children were dressed. And this is little Howard Eng. This picture is taken probably early 30s. And he's got a little aviator outfit on. And then when I started looking, I remembered that, that's the time like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh. There's kind of this flight is new, and there's these celebrity pilots, and they're all in the news. And there's sort of this trend for kids to wear these things. And so that he's a little Chinese guy. But here you see the same kind of thing in a Sikh Canadian family where their son is wearing that with the goggles. And so even that kind of popular culture moves its way through different groups. This is Leonard Chow. So now this is taken during the war. So there Leonard's wearing a little army outfit, and there he's wearing a little Air Force outfit. So it's interesting how it reflects what's going on at the time is reflected in the photos. And this is PC Kwan. So some of you may remember the very famous restaurant in Chinatown called Ho Ho Chop Suey. It was on Pender, and it had this great big neon sign with a bowl of rice, and the steam would go up, and it was like a 3-story tall neon sign, probably the best that's ever been in Vancouver. So this is him and his family. PC Kwan is the second from the left. But I find it interesting. So this is now late 40s. And in the late 40s, there were all these cowboy shows, like Cowboys Became King. And you had like Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and all these shows. And it's reflected in how the children are, they're wearing here. He's got the little cowboy outfit. She's got the pioneer girl outfit on for the photo. So it says something about popular culture. This is also, I found it interesting, the just portrait photography, how it evolves to how it very much is informed by Hollywood photography. I found this interesting, the hair. So you go from this, whoops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way now, to this large hair in the 40s, and it crosses over cultures, like groups, community groups. She's Italian, another Chinese girl. And then by the late 40s, you're getting more subdued haircuts again, going a little softer, as this shot of Edith, hand colored again, beautiful photo of her. Same with men. So there's like this more earlier, more traditional photograph. And then you go to these kind of romantic, almost like you would see Hollywood shots, lots of shadow, looking away from the camera. This Fred Singh, he ran the Frito-Lay potato chip factory or something. He owned it for a while. And Wendell, I'll just stop on him for a moment. So Wendell was, they were born in Russia. The family was from Russia, but they were actually German. And Wendell was living in Vancouver. He was a mechanic. And when his daughter gave me the photo, she said, my father hated having his photo. He just thought he looked terrible. And then one day someone told him, look, go to Yucho Chow. If anyone can do a great photo of you, it'll be Yucho Chow. And this photo was taken. And Wendell liked it so much, he paid the extra to have it hand painted. It looks like something out of Mad Men. And apparently this was the only photograph ever that he loved. And his family inherited it. It's been sort of passed down in the family. So it's really a beautiful shot. He looks great in it. A little bit about symbolism. I know that props were very important in these early photography. They meant something. And I started noticing how many people had books. So here's this Tommy Lum. He came as a kid to Canada. He's got a book. He's very nicely dressed. And then this is a Sikh Canadian, Samuel Jagat Singh. Now, Samuel was interesting because he was Sikh, and then he converted to Christianity. And in between that time, he was beaten up badly by his community. They just felt like he was a traitor becoming a Christian. But he became very good friends with a very well-known priest or minister, and he studied under him. Here he's looking very Western in this shot. And then you notice the books, like you don't usually see that many big books. So there's some symbolism there of how scholarly he was becoming. Same with this little girl, Polly Ma. There's another one of her sister also with a book. So they're trying to signify to people in China, our daughters are getting an education. This is a Croatian, two little Croatian boys. Again, the books are really important. This is probably 1916, 1917, so a very early family photo. And this is the Sangara family, and I include this for a couple of different reasons. One is when the original photo was taken, they only had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children. And she was pregnant at the time. Then she had the next child, and it was later superimposed. That was the little kid sitting in the front there, sort of, wearing blue. He's superimposed. I don't think Yucho Chow did that, though. It doesn't seem like his work. But in addition to that, all the kids in the front row have a book. even the little girl. And it was important, again, for the family to signify that even our daughters can get educated in Canada. And this is another photo again to be sent back home. Besides books, one of the other things that appears on occasion is a clock. So lots of flowers, but that clock is interesting in this photo. So this is Alexander Clement. He was Polish. He came to Canada and had to work hard and save for 8 years to bring his wife and 2 daughters over. And so the clock, probably at the time this photo was taken in the early 20s, was meant to say, maybe I'm waiting for you, right? It's lots of time is going by. I'm waiting for you to come. But interestingly, in hindsight, that clock has a double meaning because sadly, within a year that Alexander got his family here, they took a photo, the kids arrived, wife arrives, there's a photo from Yucho Chow. And a year later, he disappears from the photo. And when I asked the family why, they said a year after the family was finally reunited, he was killed in a logging accident. So that clock has a double meaning in this photo, but only in hindsight. This one has a candlestick phone on the left. I haven't seen one like that before. So I'm wondering if the family brought that, and the idea was to show, you know, we actually have a phone at a time when very few people had phones. We've advanced enough, you know, we're successful. And I put this one in here because these are 3 men. Again, the symbolism, you know, roughly all the same age, but each sitting on a very different chair. And one's holding a book, one is holding a newspaper, and one has his arms folded, looking very smug. And I feel like somehow Yucho Chow was reflecting something about each of these men by the chair he chose and by the prop he gave them. Now, moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit here about what I call silent photos. And these are photos that we have very little information on. I call them silent because they've lost their voice, they've lost their story. And it actually makes me really sad because I look at it and I realize that's a soul that's looking back at me. That was a moment that somebody celebrated, and yet it's all evaporated. All the story has been lost. I start with this one because, again, this is one of my favorites. Look at that guy. Like, he has got a new suit on. Look at the crease in his pants. It's sharp like a razor. A little bow tie. He looks so happy and so proud. And I just wish I knew who they were. It's another photo of a Black Canadian couple taken late 30s, early 40s. He's wearing a cowboy hat. A lot of Blacks who came up from America actually settled in Alberta, so maybe he was from Alberta. This one I bought recently. I found it on eBay. It was up for sale. And so this guy is probably in town for a short while. He hears that, oh, you can go get your photograph taken at this Chinese guy. And I just like it. I just like the way he's sitting there. He's not smiling. He's got a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And again, who is he? You know, what was his story? This is a Sikh Canadian couple who we have no idea who they are. Again, these photos were often sent back home, but sometimes you would, you know, people were very careful who they gave photos to because they cost money. So you would give them to your best friend. So this was actually found in a family's collection, but the person who they had given it to was long gone, and the story didn't continue on. 2 women that we know were Swedish. This is from a private collector, Neil Whaley. We see these 4 women, and I don't think they're sisters. They kind of look alike, but what were they celebrating? Why was this photo taken? I'll stop a little bit for a moment on this one. So this is taken obviously during the First World War. And it looks like the young man is about to go off. It was very common for families to take a photo of themselves, a parent with the son, because they realized he may never come back. And for the longest time, I put this in the show. I had no idea. We had no idea who it was. It was a postcard. But I remember her coat, because I don't see many corduroy coats in the pictures that I have. And then one day during the show, a woman sent this in. She had not come to the show. She didn't know anything. She just said, this is a Yucho Chow. We see it on the stamp on the back. And the first thing I noticed was the woman with the corduroy coat. And so because of this submission, we learned a little bit about the little boy. And then the owner of the photo, Neil Whaley, the private collector, wound up just spending days and days and days sort of working back and making connections to try to find out who this woman was. And turns out, I think she's an aunt to the young boy on the far left. She was a mother, she was a widow, and she ran the Patricia Lodge on her own. But so we now have a name, and the picture has a part of its voice back. This was also another mystery photo. Nobody could figure out where on earth this was taken in Vancouver, if it was in Vancouver. Why was there a Chinese guy standing there? And again, through some connections, showing it to some people, someone recognized the pianist. And from recognizing the pianist, we found out about the band. This was actually taken in the Mandarin Gardens in Chinatown, which later became the famous Marco Polo, but this was well before, in the 30s. And by finding out, like looking at some of the Mandarin Gardens ads, we found out that the name of that singer, the name of the Chinese guy was a singer named Vic Wan, W-O-N. But didn't find much on him, only to discover about 2 months ago, when this photo came in again from Boston to me, a woman in Boston said, that's my grandfather. And his name was Victor Kamyao. And that goes back to the Kamyao I showed you earlier, which was the first Chinese to be born in Canada, and very well-known family in Chinese circles, very illustrious family. So that's Wan. Vic Wan was actually Wan Victor Kamyao. I include this in here because it's a very unusual shot and very early. This is 1914, taken on Kiefer Street. It's the Wong Wing family. He ran a tailoring shop. Apparently, he had like 3 machines, and they would sew uniforms for the hotels. But he also had this huge lineup of chairs in his tailoring shop, and Chinese bachelors would come. All these Chinese men who were living here but had family back home. Kind of stuck here, they would go into his tailor shop, and in between sewing, he would translate for them or write things for them. But I often wonder why this photo in the middle of the street, and then there's another one, same day. So there's a bit of a mystery to that. Like, it's an unusual kind of photo to have taken. Who knows what that conversation was? I include some of these. These are ones, again, private collectors. So you can find these Yucho Chows every once in a while come up for sale. And we've never been able to figure that if it was a real dog or it was ceramic. Even close up, it's hard to tell. So what were these guys doing? Why'd they all come together? This is an interesting photo. It was in the show. You wonder, these 4 people, it's unusual to be sitting in the studio with a table with a big bottle and glasses on it. The newspaper has fallen down. The woman is looking intently at the girl, I think. Like, what's going on here? What's happening in this photo? Why was this taken? Why the bottle? Maybe they were celebrating an engagement, but then why the newspaper down on the floor there? It's very unusual. And one of the last mystery photos is this one that came to me about a month ago. It's 3 men, and they're each holding a bottle. I could not read the label. We tried scanning it at very high resolution, but couldn't read the label. But, did they just open up a distillery? Like, what happened there? So just to kind of conclude here, since we're at 8 o'clock, I just wanted to kind of go through, sorry, I just went through a little faster than I wanted to, some of the lessons that I've learned, and I think others have learned for this. One is that, and this is why I call it Chinatown through a wide lens, is that we tend to, we look today and we would tend to think of Chinatown in the past as being just for Chinese. And what I realize now is how remarkably diverse was it that little community was, and how for many people it was a place of refuge, not just Chinese, but so many other groups who would go there, other community groups that would feel comfortable there and who would be served, who would go into a restaurant without being harassed, who could get their photos done and get their tailoring done. And it was, this remarkably diverse community. The other thing I learned is that every person has a story. So every time somebody gave me a photo, I would say to them, find out something about the person, or at least one person in this photo. Tell me something. And that would cause like someone to go out and, talk to their aging aunt, Becky, to learn a bit more about the family history. But it seemed that except for the silent photos, there was something interesting about everyone, or some interesting moment in their life, or there was just, everybody, no matter how regular that person was, there was something interesting about them. The other thing I learned, which was very sad, is how limited family memory is. That memory and stories at most last 3 generations, usually less than that. I was so surprised at how often people couldn't even answer much about even their parents. And I've heard this common lament from people saying, geez, I wish I would have asked my dad more about, his service in the war, this or that. Because once that person goes, that memory is extinct. It has gone for good. And so I encourage people that if they're family members, you should talk to them and record it. And the last thing, and I think this was what I found probably the most heartwarming, was that all these photos of all these people came from all 4 corners of the earth. They had different skin colors, different languages, different religions. And yet fundamentally, and these pictures are a testament to that, these people were the same. They shared similar aspirations, and needs and desires. And that, especially when I put on the show and you could see all across all the walls, all these photos together, it became so evident that we're, even back then and even today, we're not that different after all. We share more in common than we do have differences. And I think what I liked about Yucho Chow was how remarkably open he was to everybody. Maybe he was just a shrewd businessman, but maybe he genuinely was just really open to serving everyone. So one of the things left from all of this is the problem with exhibitions is they're temporary, right? By their very nature, they kind of come and go. And so, as I said to you, when I started, there was very few Yucho Chows available in public archives. And it took me 8 years to find 200 of them. And now, because of the show, we have almost 500 from all different communities and all different time periods. And this is being assembled into a community archive. So this is a true community archive. In that it has all been crowdsourced, it's participatory archiving, people have contributed to it. And oops, there's a typo there, sorry about that. These photos will go to a major archive. We're going to start working on that now that we're completing all the entries or submissions at the end of this year, and then we'll prepare the archive. But one of the great things about it is that it will, for the first time, complete Vancouver's visual history. So if you go to many of the archives now, whether it be the Vancouver Public Library or the Vancouver Public Archives, it's mainly filled with photos of those, a lot of the donations they get are from people that were quite established. They were the majority. They had power and they had money. And what's missing are all these other groups that were here too, that also participated in the building of this city, but who were ordinary people and who came from different other kinds of backgrounds that had a lower status. But this community, the Yucho Chow Community Archive, will finally address that gap. And the last thing we produced was a limited edition coffee table book. This is a heavy book, 344 pages, color. And it's available for anyone who's interested at Massey Books in Chinatown, so you can actually pick one up there. The other place, though, is through the publisher, my publisher, which is the Chinese Canadian Historical Society of BC. That's the website there. And because of COVID, what they're offering people is that, for people who have participated tonight, is that if you use that promo code there, Yucho VHF, Yucho Vancouver Historical Foundation, they will ship it to you for free till November 3rd. So you don't have to go anywhere to get it. As I said, it's a heavy, heavy book. So the shipping is quite a savings to be able to get that. So something to keep in mind, Yucho VHF. Go to the website. There's an online book, online store, and you'll find it there. And this is the website. And just last thing is that for on this website is a lot of the history and some other photos, but we also have a page dedicated to how to identify a Yucho Chow, because his background changed over time. His various props and furnishings changed over time, but there's all sorts of little clues for things you can look for to identify if you have a Yucho Chow in your collection. So that's it, folks. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Catherine. That was fantastic. Now, there's already one question in the chat. So if anyone else has any queries, anything that Catherine's presentation sparked that you wanted to ask, please put them in there. So Susan's wondering, did Yucho Chow take any photos of members of Vancouver's Japanese community?
So that's a very good question. What I discovered, I was kind of always scratching my head, why can't I find any Japanese photos? I learned that in fact the Japanese community had their own photographers. I believe there were 2 of them at one point in time. But interestingly, after the internment, when some Japanese came back to British Columbia, their photographers never came back. They either retired or they moved out east or returned to Japan. And so interestingly, starting around 1950, you suddenly see all these photos of Japanese people, often in weddings. And it was the sons that took those photos, Yucho Chow's sons. But I find it really touching that the Japanese families who are now living in Steveston would make their way all the way up to Chinatown to get their photos taken because it was a place that felt safe for them. So it was really lovely. Yeah, there's lots, but in the post-war period.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm curious, while we wait for others to share their questions, do you have any kind of favorite photos or like favorite stories that were attached to the photos that you uncovered?
Yes, many. I pointed out a few there too, only the little kid in the top hat and tails, and the silent photo of the married couple. I notice a lot of details. The great thing about what the work I do is I scan them at such enormously high res that I can go in, I can even see fingerprints, like original fingerprints. They might be Yucho Chow's fingerprints on the, so I notice a lot of the detail on these things, yeah. But there are many, and to me, and this will sound, maybe trite, but it's not. They're all special because they all represent someone who once lived here, who was alive, who lived and loved, and so their stories come back. As I said, through the story of one man, I found the story of many, and now I'm sharing the story of many. So these photos, yeah, have helped to kindle something very remarkable that fills in a lot of gaps in our city's history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Were there other photographers in Chinatown that we know of at this time?
So none that lasted as long as Yucho Chow. There are a few that come and go, like maybe 4 years here, 5 years there. There's one other one whose name was Cecil Wand, or CB Wand Studios, it was called. He started around 22 to the mid 40s, and then he disappears. And he mainly focused on taking photos of Chinese people. So Yucho was different in that way because his clientele was bigger. Yes, yeah.
Broader base.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's come up in conversation. We've had a couple of events recently, and talking about Black histories in Vancouver.
Yes.
So
yes.
it's just been really, really interesting to see all those intersect.
Yeah.
So I was curious too, in terms of, it's obviously very much a community project. With the exhibition, it seems like there was a lot more kind of maybe interest or awareness.
Yes. Yes.
So
that's why we went from 200 to 500. I think, well, there was a lot of media coverage of it, which I think helped. And then suddenly people started, oh, that background, I've seen that background before. Mom, have you seen this background before in one of our pictures? And that started, then people started to go through. And then when I put up the site that says, here's how to identify, that led to more. And actually, I wanted to say, this was when I did the book launch, there was a really great question that was asked of me. There was a very other well-known Chinese photographer, well, relatively well-known, who is called C.D. Hoy. And he photographed mainly in the Caribou. He had a shorter period of time, but he photographed a lot of Indigenous people and kind of early Chinese. And so, and when he died, his family kept the negatives and they donated them to Barkerville. And from there, it was in a show, and there was a book made. And somebody said to me, well, wouldn't it have been a lot better had Yucho Chow's, those 80 years of negative, never been thrown out? And my first reaction was, oh, of course, yes. But the upside to having all of them gone was that one is we had to find them. And by finding them in people's own houses and basements and boxes, one is we invited participation. Two is we managed to find the stories of these people. Whereas with C.D. Hoy, you just print the negatives, right? Because you can. But in this case, you got the story and you invited people in. And so the silver lining is that we would have never known all these stories and had all these kind of lives come back to life had it not been for the fact that those things were thrown out. So there's a silver lining to having lost all of them. Although I can imagine some of the, like Roy Rogers shot. I mean, I just would have loved to have been able to see it instead of just a tiny little thing, in a photo. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you talked a little bit about kind of the fact that it's going to be a community archive. Is that kind of where the Yucho Chow story is going to kind of continue, is through that archive wherever it gets donated, or do you have kind of future plans for his work?
I don't. I'm kind of working on something else now.
Yeah, fair. You spent a lot of time on that.
10 years of my life. Yeah. So, maybe that archive will be contributed to by other people in the future. But no, I'll be glad to wrap it up. And I feel like I've done my job. And thanks to the Vancouver Heritage Foundation, more people are hearing of this story. I guess it's not just a story of him, it's a story of all these other people. It's a story of our early Vancouver history, which has been missing for so long. So. Absolutely.
And I loved what you said about it kind of completing that visual picture and filling in some of those gaps of the people that were instrumental in building the community and the city, and just because they weren't photographs doesn't mean they weren't there and they weren't important.
Yeah, exactly. Or their photographs have just never wound up in the archives, right? Because they were just,
Yeah, they're out there. They're just not.
They're out there, yeah. They're just like
somewhere that the everyday person could go and find.
Someone was telling me, oh yeah, well, I found it. I found them in an old Zeller's bag along with Zeller's receipts. Like that's where people find these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those hidden histories, they really are hidden.
They truly are, yes.
All right, we'll give everyone a couple more minutes if they have any questions. Is there anything else, Catherine, you wanted to kind of share that you didn't get a chance to touch on in the presentation?
No, I think, as I said, the book has other stories. Some of them I've incorporated from here. The archive will have even more. I'm trying to make sure that every archive entry has something. So there's lots more to see for sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the website looks like amazing, and maybe people who are tuning in tonight can see if they can spot a Yucho Chow.
Yeah.
In those steps.
Good.
Well, so just wanted to say thank you again, Katherine, for being here. Thanks to everyone for participating. It's been really great to kind of delve into Yucho Chow's remarkable photography and learn more about Vancouver's diverse early communities. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you're interested in learning more about Vancouver's history, we have lots of events that are available on our website. We also have a lot of online resources like our Heritage Site Finder, so you can keep learning about our city. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon at one of our future events.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.